Okay, so say that and we change to English. So today we have Amparo Lázaro, and we are very happy to have her because it's not common that the IPs, the PIs, present their research here, and I think it's something that is good also for the seminars to have this view. So I guess that most of you know her. She's a researcher here at the Global Change Group at Media. Well, thank you very much, Amparo. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about plant-pollinator interactions in managed landscapes. And these are I will present some of the results in the last years from my group, and in which we mostly have studied how landscape modifications affect the pollination service. So as you all know, the pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the stamens of one flower to the style of another flower, and this allows the sexual reproduction of plants. And this is mostly mediated by pollinators that are mainly insects. The mutualist relationship between plants and insects and pollinators is considered one of the main drivers of biodiversity because it's associated to the expansion of the angiosperms, that are the flowering plants that now occupy the 90% of the plant kingdom. And it's also it's associated to evolutionary processes in which two species evolve jointly due to reciprocal phenotypic selection. Pollination is also a very important ecosystem service because it's necessary to maintain the biodiversity and also the functioning of ecosystems, as almost 90% of flowering plants depend on pollinators for their reproduction, and also 75% of cultivated plants depend on pollinators. However, as you might have heard, all of you, we are now in a pollinator crisis. So the pollinators are being lost worldwide. And this is not just the loss of pollinators, but if we lose the pollinators, there are cascading losses of diversity. So some of the first group that showed this were the Weismeyer and collaborators that checked for Britain and the Netherlands that there have been strong losses of pollinators, mostly bees and syrphids, and that they were associated to these losses of pollinators, losses of flowering plants. Some years later, we decided to set up an experiment to check whether these parallel losses of plants or pollinators were actually causal, or they were just parallel losses because we were into a general loss of biodiversity. So to see whether it was the loss of pollinators which causes the loss of plants, we built an experiment that consisted in these cages. I don't know if you can see them well, but they were like pens, and they had like a fishing net that did not allow to pass all the pollinators to certain experimental plots. And then we have control plots to compare with. So with these experimental plots, we managed to reduce pollinators by a half, more or less, to the plots, and we followed the recruitment of plants during 4 years. And after 4 years, we saw that actually the reduction to the half of pollinator visits, we saw a significant reduction in the recruitment of plants and the diversity of plants that are recruited. So yes, there is a causal relationship, and this might cascade in the losses of diversity of many other organisms associated to the plants. The problem of working with ecological interactions is that it's very difficult because actually the interactions can be lost before the species that participate in these interactions are lost. So this is why this is called the silent extinction. And this the extinction of interactions has important consequences for the ecological functions and in many cases for ecosystem service. We now know that the interactions at the community level are complex networks in which many pollinator and plant species interact in complex ways. So here we might be talking about hundreds of plant species that interact with hundreds of pollinator species in complex ways. And the properties of these whole networks at the community level go beyond the properties of their components. So we use network tools to understand the structure of these interactions. And there are many metrics that we take from these structures, but mainly what we do is to understand how specialized are the interactions, both at the network and species level, and how much niche overlap are there between species. And we also detect some other general structures, that, for example, whether they have modular structure, for example, whether they are groups of species that interact more between them than with others, and these kind of things. However, if we want to predict what will happen with the pollinator communities and the pollinator service with future environmental changes, we need to understand how these networks vary along gradients. There could be natural gradients, for example, elevation gradients, or anthropogenic gradients. It could be the changes in the landscape. That is what I'm going to talk today here. So to put you in context, we can have changes in the networks along gradients because we have changes in the composition of the communities, because there are species that appear or disappear along the gradient. But we might also have changes because we have changes in the frequency of interactions. For example, if pollinators start to behave differently at the time of foraging flowers, or if it changes the spatiotemporal overlap of mutualistic partners. Lastly, we might have coevolutive partners, patterns and processes, but this happens at larger spatiotemporal scales. However, we still don't know very well how these components vary along anthropogenic changes, gradients, and how this impact the function of communities. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to present some results of 2 national projects I had. The first one, wild fund, is finished already, multi-fund is still going. And they have in common both that we studied how landscape modifications due to land use influenced wild communities, crops, and wild plants. And they also combine a series of experiments in which we combine different anthropogenic pressures, but I will not talk about that. Today I will focus on the effect on landscape of wild communities and crops. So mostly the idea of what I will present is to understand how landscape modifications affect the composition of pollinator communities, the structure of their interactions, the stability of these communities, and finally, which are the functional consequences. So how does it affect the reproduction of plants and pollinators? So we work in managed Mediterranean landscapes. You all have seen this kind of landscape because this is what you see around. So this has natural areas surrounding extensive crop fields. That is mostly almond and carob tree fields here in Mallorca. So these are managed by humans because these are agricultural landscapes. So we need to understand how this landscape function, because the insects that visit the crops actually need the natural habitats to live, to put their nests and to feed when the crops is not on. So we need to understand how these managed landscapes might be sustainable in time. This is supposed to be a map of Mallorca, but you cannot see it here. But these are all the sampling sites of our project. So these are all across the island, except for the mountains. And we mostly work in wild communities, but we have also sampled carob tree fields and almond tree fields. So this is how our study sites look like. These are our natural communities. I don't know if you can see it here, but it really has a high diversity of flowering plants in the spring. And then we have the carob tree fields and almond tree fields. So how do we characterize the landscape? We use GIS and CIOSA coordinate databases to characterize the landscape. These are databases that have land use layers. So what we do is to establish buffer zones surrounding the study sites that of different, actually we work at different scales, 1 kilometer, 2 kilometer, half kilometer, and characterize the buffer zone by determining the percentage of natural habitat that we have surrounding the sites, which is very related in our case with the percentage of crops. It's just the contrary. And also landscape heterogeneity, that is the diversity of land use layers in the landscape. And why is heterogeneity important? Heterogeneity is super important, and mainly here, because when you have a very heterogeneous landscape, then you have many more habitats and microhabitats for the species. So this allows a higher diversity of pollinators, which is good for the pollination service in natural communities and crops. So the most conserved the landscape, the higher percentage of natural habitats and the higher landscape heterogeneity here. So how do we sample? We normally sample plant-pollinator interactions just by walking along permanent transects. You can see Miguel here with a hand net. So we basically, every single insect we see on a flower, we catch it for identification. We need to catch it because most of them cannot be identified in the field. Actually, they need a high taxonomical work that is conducted by Miguel in our group. But we also sample interactions by taking the pollen grains that the pollinators that we have captured on the body and identifying them in the microscope. Because by looking at the pollen grains, you can determine the species that they were carrying pollen from. We also do independent samplings of flowers by using sampling squares in which we count all the flowers that we have and identify them. And we also characterize them using databases, but also doing measurements in the field. And even we sometimes need to do experiments to cover the flowers and see whether they are able to auto-pollinate and things like that. We do independent samplings of pollinators as well by using palm traps. These are dishes with different colors that attract the pollinators. And this is useful to know how many pollinators there are in the community and not just we are seeing on the flowers. Lastly, we estimate the reproductive success of the components of the network. So, for example, to study pollinator reproduction, we have built nests for the solitary bees and solitary wasps. And these are wooden things in which we do a hole with different diameters to serve as a nest for different species. So you see here a nest inside, well, two nests. This is a bee nest. So you see how it works is that a solitary bee, a mother, puts an egg, then a wall, an egg, a wall, an egg, a wall. And bees are fed with pollen from flowers. And this is a nest of wasps that are fed with animals, for example, spiders. And this is useful to know how much the insects reproduce. The reproduction of plants is much easier because we just need to take the fruits and count the seeds that they produce. So we have done this with many wild plants in wild communities and also with the crops. And now I will show you briefly, I hope, some of the main results we are taking on this. First, I will show you which are the effects we see of landscape modifications on the plant pollinator community. What we expect the first is that along disturbance gradients, the disturbance gradients, they work as a strong environmental filter, so that along the gradient, the communities have fewer and fewer species. But it's not only that, it's that the species that remain in very disturbed places are more similar because you only have the species that has the traits that makes them able to survive in these conditions. So there is, along the gradients, there is a functional homogenization of communities. And the specialist species, the rare species, and those in a higher trophic levels are those that first to be lost. I will start showing you the results of crops that are much easier. Because in crops, the plant community does not vary, it's just the crop. So the only thing that varies is the types of insects that arrive to the crops. So you can see here that when there is a higher percentage of natural areas in the landscape, then we have a higher pollinator richness, that we have more pollinator species going to the crops. And we also have higher visitation of honeybees. Honeybees are managed pollinators. They are replaced by humans, but they go more to these fields. When we go to natural communities, that is much more complex because we have many species of plants and pollinators, so the results are more complex. This is for natural communities, the plant community. So you see here that actually the peak of richness, so the number of species is peaking at intermediate landscape disturbance, which agrees with the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. However, this peak is mostly due to ruderal species, that is like weeds, that are not that important for the functioning of the community. And when we look at the functional diversity, so that's taking into account the traits of the species, then we see that actually, when as the landscape is being more and more disturbed, the functional diversity is decreasing. If we look at the pollinators, we also found some similar results. You see here, for example, this is landscape heterogeneity and flower richness. These are like measurements of the diversity of resources that the pollinators have at different levels, at the level of landscape and the more local level. And you see that as this diversity of resources increases, both the abundance and the richness of wild pollinators also increase. And this is not related to the landscape, but you see here that if we have too many honeybees in the place, then we have fewer wild pollinators. And it's not only that we reduce the diversity and the abundance, but also the composition of the communities change, because as the landscape heterogeneity is changing, there were appearing more, the abundance of different groups of insects is varying. You can see here, for example, that along heterogeneity gradients, we see how the social Hymenoptera increase and builders decrease, and we also have a higher abundance of small insects. So this was about the composition of the communities, but what does it happen with the interactions? Well, what we expected is that as the resource diversity increased at the landscape and local scales, we have richer communities with more species and more traits. And this should have implications for the structure of interactions. And we expected that when we had richer communities, we might have networks with higher complexity, in which there were more specific interactions. And we expected higher niche segregation in these conditions and higher modularity and functional complementarity. So according to this, we found that as landscape heterogeneity increased, the specialization of interactions in the network increased, and also the modularity. This is that you have groups of species that interact between them, and this is important because when the interactions are more specialized, are more efficient, and so they work better. And we also had a higher functional complementarity. So when the communities are complex and rich, there is higher niche segregation, and this is good for the function of the community. However, the interactions are not static, they change over time. So in one time and the following, you don't have exactly the same interactions. Why? Because the communities are changing because of phenologies and because changes between years in the abundance of different components, etc. So the changes over time in interactions, well, we can call them interaction turnover, can be decomposed in two components that are changes due to changes in species. So in time, there are species that has appeared or disappeared from the networks, or to what we call rewiring. Rewiring is that we have the same species in both times, but then the species just interact in a different way. And understanding how this rewiring occurs and why is important because it might be what it helps the species to adapt to, and the communities to adapt to changing conditions. So we hypothesized that rewiring may change along landscape gradients because when we have a higher habitat loss, then we have communities that are fewer in species, but also have more similar flower traits. So in these conditions, we expected a higher rewiring. Why? Because at the end, interactions for pollination and foraging decisions. So when the insect has many things to choose, they will go to the preferred species. However, if the communities are very poor and you have very few species, very few to choose, at the end you go to everything because they need to eat. And also, when the traits are more similar between them, there is a higher probability that the insects change or make mistakes. So we expected a higher rewiring in this type of communities, and that this higher rewiring was associated with more unstructured networks. According to this, we found that when we had habitat loss, so very little natural habitat, we actually had higher rewiring between the species in the network, and that this rewiring was associated to losses in the structure of the networks measured with a specialization and nestedness. So now I pass to the, so it does affect the communities, it does affect the interactions, and does it affect the stability of the communities and interactions? So I start with crops, that again is easier. With crops, it's just the pollinators that can change, but not the plants. And so we can just measure the stability as the coefficient of variation, of the inverse of the coefficient of variation. So the larger the coefficient of variation, the lower the stability. And you can see here that it does affect. So the landscape, natural habitats in the landscape evenness, that is a measurement of landscape heterogeneity, is linked to positively related to the stability of pollinator visits to crops. And very interestingly, the stability of pollinator visits is directly related to the stability of fruit production in the crops. So if we want to have not only crops that produce a lot, but also that they are very reliable, we need to conserve the landscape surrounding it. In measuring stability in natural communities is much more complicated because, again, we have many species of plants and pollinators and complex relationships. But what it has been seen in general is that the stability of general network structures is more or less stable through time, but the components of the networks are very variable. So we have species that go in and out and interactions that are changing all the time. So by seeing this, I wonder whether it would be the same as the relationship between stability of communities and variation of species, because we now know that the diversity stabilizes ecosystem services because it stabilizes assemblages that perform particular functions. So I decided to use the portfolio effect. This is a measure that is used normally in meta-population dynamics studies, and to check whether to check how the landscape affected the stability of interactions. So the idea of the portfolio is that independent variation of the populations that compose a community makes the whole biomass of the community to be stable. So this is calculated just as taking into account the mean and variance of different populations that compose the community, and extrapolating it and compare it to the mean and variance of your actual community. So the larger this portfolio effect, the larger is the stability due to portfolio effect in this community. So the graphs are not very good because the axes are a bit like this because they were together with other figures. But what we found is that it actually, the landscape evenness, that is a measurement of heterogeneity in the landscape, is positively related to the stability of all plant pollinators and their interactions. But in case of pollinators and interactions, this effect only occurs from moderate to high levels of landscape heterogeneity, because all this is not different from zero. This is normal because plants cannot move, but the pollinators can move through the landscape, so they can amortiguate some kind of the loss of heterogeneity in the landscape. So yes, the landscape also influences the stability of the communities. And I'm going now to the last part, that is on the function. Okay, so it does affect the communities and the interactions, but does it affect the final function, the reproduction of plants and insects here? Yes, it does. Here are some of the results for the reproduction of pollinators. And so this is just an example, but you can see here that the percentage of natural habitat increase. We have more cells per nest. Cells are these, remember, these parts of the nest. That means that if we have more natural habitats, same as if we have more abundance of flowers, then the single mothers, they put many more eggs, and they reproduce more. Very interestingly as well is that when we have higher flower richness, we get a higher proportion of female bees and wasps. I don't know if you know, but the bees and wasps, they can't decide the sex of their kids. So when they normally decide to have females when the conditions are better for reproduction. And this is good because having a higher percentage of females means that there will be more mothers that will put more eggs. But not only that, it's also very interesting because actually the females are better providers of pollination service to plants. So these are results that we did with pollen networks, and you can see here that the females actually carry many more pollen grains of the species that they visit compared to males. And this is normal as well, because I mean, females have to take care of the kids, so they go and collect pollen to provide the nests, and males just go to flowers to feed themselves. So that's normal. So I leave the insects and I go to the reproduction of characteristics. I will use this to illustrate the production of crops. We studied how the landscape again affected the reproduction and also other local management, but they will not talk about this here. So you can see here, this is CCA, and you can see here that more natural habitats to run in the fields are related to many kind of pollinators, including wild bees. While the contrary, there will be here that will be more disturbed habitats are more related to the visits of honeybees, that are those placed by humans. And I may say, for those that don't know, that wild pollinators are much better, much more efficient pollinating crops than honeybees. According to this, we also found that the communities with higher proportion of wild bees actually had a higher seed weight than fields pollinated mostly by honeybees. And also, of course, seed weight increased with pollinator abundance. So yes, for the crops, we also see an effect. What about the networks? This is again more complicated in wild communities because we have many species. There are many studies that relate the structure of the networks to the many functions. But they are theoretical because it is quite difficult to test this with empirical studies. But we are trying to do this. This is one work that of us some time ago, it was one of the first that relate the role of species in the network with their fitness, so with the reproductive success of the species. And in this way, we saw that closeness, centrality, I would say centrality, I will explain you what is centrality, but centrality of species was linked to the reproductive success of species. However, we don't expect the species to behave similarly along the gradient. Why? Because the different context of each community, both because of the landscape and the composition of the community at the end, is going to determine the species that are visit this species and therefore their role in the community. So this, our objective here was to understand how the landscape influences the relationship between network metrics, in this particular case, the centrality and fitness. What is centrality? This is a network metric. It shows how close to all the other, this is a plant species, so how close is to all the other plant species in the community via the pollinators they share. So it's very similar to the concept of network, having social networks. So if a plant that is very central is very related to all the others through the pollinators they share. And why is this metric important? Because species that are more central are more important to maintain the structure of the poly interaction. Because if they are not there, everything collapses. These species, to be central, they need to be highly visited because they might need to be very interesting, attractive for the pollinators, but they also need to be very generalist, which means that they might be visited by a very wide variety of pollinators. So our hypothesis was that, okay, we expect that, well, several works have shown that centrality improves fitness, but we thought, okay, centrality might improve fitness in communities that are more disturbed. Because in this kind of communities, the generalization of interactions is favorable because to maintain the reproduction. However, in landscapes that are very conserved, what we expect is that both being specialists or generalists are very good alternative options because we see also a lot of specialized interactions. So according to this, we also found that this is centrality here, and this is the reproduction of species that is measured as seed per flower. So as you can see here, in more conserved landscapes, so with high heterogeneity, it doesn't matter how central the species are for the reproduction. However, when the landscape is more disturbed, being more central is better for them, for their fitness. So in conclusion, communities in the starved landscapes, they actually have lower taxonomic and functional diversity. They're also more unstable and generalist, and they have more unstructured interactions. And there is a worse pollination service both for wild plants and crops. And the fact that the more generalist species do better in the starved landscapes, which will lead is increase, it will make the communities increasingly generalist and unstructured over time in these places. And this is what I wanted to explain you, and I would like to thank you for listening, and to all the people, because this is a work in which many people have contributed and participated, so I also want to thank all my group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amparo, for this interesting talk. Any questions?
I have some questions. Very nice. I have some questions. One is related to the succession. So because flowers, I guess, I mean, I'm microbiologist, have no idea, but I had seen the landscape that flowers, they do not all, so plants do not flower simultaneously. So you have succession of flowering. And how does this affect, for example, could your responsibilities be taken into account? So it's not the same in the beginning of spring than at the end of spring, for example. You have different flowers that appear and disappear, and this probably is connected to the health of the insects or the kind of the insect about.
Yeah. Actually, we do several measurements along the season, and yes, the communities change a lot. The abundance and diversity of plants, and the abundance and diversity of insects, and mostly network analysis are conducted doing consider them as static, so just joining all the species in the communities. But it is changing because we are now including dynamics. So I have shown you the dynamics of some results for the dynamics of the communities. So yes, we not only study the whole thing as a static, but we also see how the interactions change along the time with the changes in the composition of communities. And this is a very interesting topic, and we are working more and more on this. Also trying to understand how, when an insect changes the species, because sometimes you have both species in different times, but then you see that they change it. And this might be very much related to changes in the relative abundance, and also with the other options that they have, because at the end there are foraging decisions. So you decide depending on what you have available in that moment. So, yeah.
I have a question more. So one other is the intermediate disturbances hypothesis. What were the disturbances and the thresholds that you were managing? Because you said, well, this fits with the hypothesis of the intermediate.
The threshold we use is what we have in the landscape. So I think it's going from our study system. So I think we had from 10 to 70% of natural habitat surrounding. So this was what we had empirically, and we get this relationship with fits this. I also have gotten this relationship in other studies, also on ingredients.
This would mean that the intermediate, so manipulation, so not completely natural, so will be the best one. So because your thresholds are from the most intervened and from the very wide.
Yeah, it depends on what. For example, for the number of species, yes, having intermediate disturbance is good. I also, in another system, in Greek islands that are also Mediterranean, we found that actually in intermediate disturbance in agricultural landscapes is good not only for the richness of species, but also for the whole structure of the network. So the richness of interactions and everything. So a little bit of disturbance is good because it gives more niches. So there are more species appear, and it does not allow the dominance of a single one. And this is very typical in Mediterranean landscapes that are traditionally managed. So it's actually managed, but in not a very intensive way that destroys everything, but and for many years. I mean, and this is good. But for example, we here have seen that you have more species in the intermediate disturbance, but then you lose functional diversity over the whole gradient. So it depends for what.
So my last question is related to this. So you have now in Mallorca, for example, different landscapes with different degree of health. Because you have all these almond trees infected by salmonella, and field trees, so fields that are all of them infected, and you might have other that are not infected. So can you also track this component of health?
That would be very cool. But I guess it could be possible, but it's quite difficult to work in this, to get enough data to build these networks and everything. It's like you need a lot of field work to get enough samples, but it would be a very cool idea to link it with the health. I think so.
More questions? Martin, you have a question?
I have a question. I don't know if it's sort of half baked and is related to what Ramon was saying. So in some of the plots that we had at the beginning, if I recall well, you had obviously you have your trend, but the variability seems to have some structure, right? So the spread around your trend seems to be larger, sort of like in the middle. Is sort of what Ramon was saying.
What kind of graphs are you talking about?
I've seen too many plots.
I mean, the variability, well, you know you are physicist, so this is not. The variability, the real variability in field is crazy.
No, but I guess my question is related to the fact that sometimes, right, you see when you go and sample, right, the scatter plots here, for example, they look much more variable in a sense in the intermediate region than in other regions. Maybe in this case, it's the middle plot, but this is an example of that. So, and I was wondering that variability, I guess, might be related to the fact that the system maybe is different samples that have the same, what's the name of the same
Heterogeneity. Yeah, I mean, you know.
So, in a sense, you have a more, seems to me that it indicated you have a structure, we have a network that is more malleable in a sense. Maybe it's less stable, but it can adapt or fluctuate more. And I was wondering whether
Each point of this is a network.
Yeah, I understand. And so you have a lot of different structures, right? And because you have a wide range in the y-axis, wider range in the y-axis.
Yeah, I fully understand.
Right.
I think you can see this here, but not really in others. But I think it's because we do have more places with intermediate heterogeneity than in the streams, and there are many more variables that affect. I'm showing you here just the landscape because I wanted to focus on something this talk, but actually we have many other variables even in those sites that are also affecting and have additional effects.
But my question was on the relation between success and stability, right? So at a certain point, if I understand well, your portfolio effect was a measurement of how stable the network was, but is stability necessarily connected to a successful, let's say, a fitter network, or it could be that something is less stable? It can be fitter because it can adapt to a wider range.
Yeah, actually, stability, it depends on the scale at which you measure it. So to have communities that are stable, you need to have populations within communities that are unstable. And this occurs for everything. So also in the landscape. So if you want to have a region that is stable, you might have communities that vary between them, because this is the best way of adapt to changing conditions. So yeah, I think you are right. And this is what we measure actually with the portfolio effect. That actually, we measure it within the community, so that the communities more stable are those that have the populations more unstable, let's say, or more variable between them. I think this might happen at every scale that we will have. So I think sometimes we aim at having something like very stable, that is very, and is, okay, we need an stability to get stability. It depends on what scale we are talking about.
Okay, so I think we can stop here. Thank you very much, Amparo.